Hey guys, tonight we wander into a world where your teeth chatter just thinking about bedtime. You probably won't survive this, well, not without imagining the pioneer grit and some serious layering. Picture yourself stepping off a creaking wooden porch into the gray, snow-laden wilderness of the 1800s. Every breath of air bites your lungs, your fingers start to sting, and the horizon is a blur of frozen whites and grays. The sky hangs heavy, low and foreboding, promising nights that stretch longer than a Sunday sermon. And yet, people once called this home, called these bitter winters their normal, trudging through the frost with determination you might only muster for your morning alarm. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fun to know which parts of the world are cozying up or shivering along with us. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander down the slope behind your imagined log cabin, snow crunching under your boots, and the wind howls like it knows every secret you're trying to keep. You realize immediately, survival isn't just about not freezing, it's about rhythm, routine, and respect for the sheer force of nature. In these frontier landscapes, the snow isn't just decorative, it's a relentless, omnipresent challenge, covering trails, hiding hazards, and demanding every ounce of effort to gather firewood or fetch water. Scholars still argue whether pioneers overprepared for some winters or simply had no choice but to treat every storm like a siege. Either way, the stakes are palpable. Inside the cabin, a faint curl of smoke drifts from the hearth, carrying the smell of burning pinewood and the faint tang of charred coals. The furniture is sparse, utilitarian, chairs carved from logs, a table scratched by decades of chopping and chopping again, perhaps a wool blanket draped over the back of a bench to fight off nighttime drafts. You run your fingers along the rough wood and imagine someone, long ago, sat here, humming to themselves as the wind shrieked outside, plotting how they'd survive another night. Oddly enough, a cat or a dog might have curled up near the hearth, providing warmth and companionship, their tiny breaths visible in the frozen air. You move closer to the window, fog forming from your breath, and notice the landscape beyond. The trees are skeletal, heavy with snow, and their branches bend under the weight like old men at the market. Your eyes follow a distant plume of smoke rising from another cabin. You're not alone in this frozen expanse. Life out here relies on a strange combination of cunning, stubbornness, and an odd optimism that even when everything outside threatens to kill you, somehow, you'll make it. And often, survival meant improvising with whatever was at hand. A pile of old blankets becomes a makeshift draft stopper, a broken pot serves as a kettle, and a burlap sack can substitute for mittens when nothing else is dry. The first night is always the hardest. Darkness falls early, and every shadow seems alive, flickering as candlelight dances across the walls. You realize how dependent modern life has made you on electricity. You don't have a heater humming, lights to banish shadows, or instant coffee to fuel your bones. You're forced to confront time differently. Hours stretch, measured by how long it takes the fire to burn down, or how long it takes to finish a chapter of a well-thumbed book by the dim glow of an oil lamp. It's intimate, intense, and slightly exhausting, but in a way that feels strangely grounding. You settle in, wrapping yourself tighter in imagined wool blankets, and think about the people who faced winters like this year after year. They had no heating bills, no pre-packaged meals, no Netflix to distract them. They had each other, their routines, and a stubborn will to keep moving, keep chopping wood, keep stirring the pot. Oddly enough, some communities would light multiple fires at night so that smoke patterns warned neighbors of any unexpected threats, whether predator or human. A quirky little precaution, almost like Morse code in the snow. By the time your eyes start to droop, the cabin's interior glows faintly from the dying fire. You feel a strange mixture of fatigue and awe, a humbling awareness of the ingenuity and toughness required just to survive, let alone thrive. Tomorrow, you think, will demand more firewood, more water, more vigilance, but tonight, the snow whispers outside, and the world is temporarily paused. You allow yourself this small luxury, imagining how it would feel to sit by the fire, sharing a story, a song, a laugh, even in the face of relentless cold. The pioneers, winters were not just physical tests, They were mental marathons. Every small success, whether it's stacking wood correctly, keeping the draft out, or preparing a warm meal, becomes a victory. And in this imagined moment, you understand a tiny fragment of that reality. Life slowed, senses sharpened, and every decision mattered. That wind howls still outside, but inside the cabin, the world is a little more forgiving, and your heartbeat slows, syncing with a rhythm older than any clock. So you breathe, deeply and deliberately, letting the cold imaginings fill your lungs without panic, letting the pioneer mindset sink in. And somewhere in that quiet understanding, you feel the first glimmers of respect for the resilience, creativity, and sheer stubbornness that allowed humans to endure winters that modern conveniences would never let you experience firsthand. The snow might still fall, the wind might still bite, but in this tiny imagined corner of history, you start to grasp what it truly means to survive. You step back outside, brushing the snow from your boots, and take a closer look at the log cabin that will be your temporary world for tonight. Every chink between logs is a potential enemy, cold drafts sneaking in like invisible whispers. You quickly learn that pioneers were part carpenter, part scientist, part magician, because making a cabin winter ready without electricity required an almost obsessive understanding of wood, air, and snow. Logs are never just logs. You notice their thickness, the way they're stacked in tight horizontal layers, notched at the corners so they interlock like giant, wooden Lego pieces. The builders understood that a poorly notched corner could transform a cozy cabin into a wind tunnel nightmare. You can almost hear the debate. Scholars still argue whether pioneers preferred pine, oak, or cedar for its natural insulating properties, or simply used whatever grew closest. Either way, each log represents hours of labor, sweat freezing to skin, and a kind of tactile genius that seems almost lost to time. Inside, the gaps between logs are filled with chinking, a mixture of clay, moss, and straw. You reach down, imagining the process, scraping moss from trees, crushing clay with bare hands, and mixing it with water to form a paste that will block wind. Oddly enough, some cabins even included leftover horsehair or animal fur in the mix, a small quirk of ingenuity that added extra warmth while giving you a glimpse of the resourcefulness required for survival. You shiver just thinking about kneeling on a cold, snowy floor, hands numb, trying to seal every tiny crack before nightfall. The roof is another story. You crane your neck upward and notice overlapping shingles or rough-hewn wooden boards, weighted down with more logs or rocks to hold them in place against the wind. You wonder how many times builders had to climb up in midwinter to patch leaks, the cold biting through gloves, every breath turning to vapor before your eyes. Some historians suggest that certain communities even buried the roof's edges under a layer of snow intentionally. The snow acts as extra insulation, a natural blanket that keeps the cold out while quietly hinting at just how inventive human beings can be under pressure. You wander around the cabin's perimeter, imagining the pioneers' logic for orientation. Facing the main wall toward the south is practical. They knew it maximized sun exposure in winter, the weak sunlight creeping in to offer a few precious extra degrees. You pause and smile at how little things like compass awareness or simple math could mean the difference between shivering and staying marginally warm. A quirky aside. Some pioneers would plaster soot on the cabin's interior walls to absorb heat from the hearth more efficiently, an odd mix of necessity and accidental science that somehow works. You step back inside, letting your gaze sweep over the interior once more. You notice that floors are often raised slightly, gaps stuffed with straw or pine needles to reduce cold seeping upward. And the furniture is strategically placed to create small heat pockets around the fireplace, as if the pioneers intuitively understood that heat flows like water, seeking the path of least resistance. Scholars still argue whether such practices were learned from trial and error or quietly borrowed from European traditions, but either way, the results are undeniable. Even without electricity, the cabins could retain enough warmth to survive nights that might otherwise kill. Your eyes land on a simple door, its latch wooden, simple, and surprisingly sturdy. When closed, it seals the cabin tightly, preventing even the slightest whisper of wind from slipping through. Oddly enough, pioneers sometimes added a thick blanket over the door frame at night, reducing drafts further, giving the effect of a natural, makeshift double door. You imagine tugging it aside in the morning, brushing off snowflakes, and stepping into a frozen world again, one that simultaneously terrifies and fascinates you. As your attention returns to the hearth, you realize that insulation isn't just about stopping drafts, it's about layering survival itself. The pioneers understood that every detail mattered. The log choice, the chinking, the roof, the placement of furniture, the careful stacking of firewood near entrances. Each cabin was an ecosystem, a microcosm of human ingenuity designed to wrest warmth from an otherwise merciless environment. And as you trace your fingers along the rough walls, imagining countless hands performing the same motions over decades, you feel the continuity of human survival, an invisible chain linking past to present. Outside, the wind still howls, teasing the cabin as if daring it to fail. Inside, the atmosphere is cozy but tense. You understand immediately why pioneers valued silence, quiet conversation, and careful routine. Every small task, from sealing a gap to stacking logs near the hearth, becomes an act of defense. Oddly, some cabins included little alcoves for drying wet clothing or hanging herbs to ward off illness. These quirks aren't just practical, they hint at a philosophy of life that merges survival, superstition, and the subtle aesthetics of comfort. You sit near the hearth, imagining the pioneer family that might have lived here. The father checking the logs for cracks, the mother kneeling to patch chinking, children peeking curiously at the smoke curling upward. Each member knows their role, and you realize that survival is almost a choreography, a rhythm learned and passed down. Without electricity, there are no instant fixes, no quick warmth. Everything requires anticipation, effort, and a kind of patient respect for the elements. Scholars still argue whether such systems were more about ingenuity or sheer stubbornness, but from where you sit, imagining the tiny details, it's probably a bit of both. Night descends, and the cabin breathes warmth back at you. You feel a connection not just to the pioneers, but to a larger pattern of human adaptation. Our ability to turn scarcity into strategy, cold into a teacher, and basic materials into protection. Oddly, even the smallest details, the layering of logs, the moss and chinking, the weighted roof, become almost poetic, testament to human persistence against a world that's often indifferent. And in that moment, you realize, survival isn't just about warmth, it's about attentiveness, creativity, and noticing the small victories that accumulate into life itself. You step outside again, and the first thing that hits you is the smell, pine, cedar, and that faintly acrid tang of split wood. You realize immediately that survival in a pioneer winter hinges on one simple truth: firewood. Without it, the log cabin is just a frozen box, and the hearth is an empty promise. You probably won't last 5 minutes if you don't respect the woodpile. The pioneers didn't just gather logs. They created carefully orchestrated systems, almost like miniature ecosystems, to ensure warmth would be there when the wind roared. You wander over to a neatly stacked pile beside the cabin. Every piece is split and arranged to maximize airflow and prevent rot. Oddly, some settlers even placed the logs upside down or in crisscross patterns, a quirky practice that kept the pile from toppling and allowed snow to slide off naturally. You can almost hear the debate. Scholars still argue whether such techniques were truly widespread or just anecdotal innovations that survived in folklore. Either way, it works. You kneel next to the pile, imagining the labor involved. Axes bite through frozen logs, sending splinters flying into frozen snow. You try a swing in your mind, and your arms immediately protest. Splitting wood requires technique, patience, and an understanding of grain that you don't appreciate until the cold settles into your bones. Oddly, some families would even use leftover stove ashes to mark which logs were seasoned enough to burn efficiently, a subtle hack you'd never think of in modern life, but brilliant in its practicality. Stacking the pile isn't just about neatness. You notice the small gaps between logs, carefully spaced to encourage airflow, preventing mold and allowing the wood to burn hotter. You realize that every log's orientation, from base to top, matters. Too tightly packed, and it rots. Too loosely packed, and it collapses under the weight of snow. And of course, the pile must be elevated slightly off the ground, either on stones or split logs, because nothing freezes a fire faster than damp wood. Scholars still argue whether pioneers invented these practices independently in each region or whether they learned them from neighboring communities. You imagine the routine: early morning trips to the nearby forest, the crunch of boots over frost-hardened underbrush, the hiss of saws cutting through timber. Every member of the family has a role. One drags the freshly cut logs, another splits them, while children carefully stack and sort by size. Oddly, some families created small, emergency wood caches, hidden from view, a secret stash meant for blizzards so severe you couldn't make your way to the main supply. You smile, realizing these little survival hacks feel surprisingly modern in ingenuity. Back at the cabin, you begin to understand why the hearth never truly runs out of firewood. The woodpile isn't a passive resource, it's an active strategy. Logs are rotated. Seasoned wood burns first, newer cuts stay for later, and oddly shaped pieces are tucked where they'll catch fire slowly, maintaining a long, steady heat. You can almost sense the rhythm of the family working this system, a subtle choreography born from necessity and repetition over countless winters. The smell of burning wood fills the air. You notice that the pioneers understood more than just heat, they understood comfort. Placing split pine too close to the hearth might produce sparks, but perfectly positioned, the logs provide a steady flame, cozy light, and even a small sense of security against predators lurking outside. Oddly, in some regions, they would even store wood in lean-tos covered with animal hides to further insulate it from snow and rain. That quirky touch feels surprisingly luxurious considering the circumstances. You run your hand over the pile, feeling the rough texture, the subtle warmth where the sun has touched it. Every groove, knot, and split tells a story of labor, strategy, and adaptation. You realize that firewood isn't just fuel, it's a kind of lifeline, a tangible measure of survival. Scholars still argue whether the efficiency of these woodpiles mattered more than sheer volume, but from where you stand, you can see that it's both. Quantity keeps you alive, quality keeps you comfortable. Night approaches again, and the first logs are brought inside. You watch the careful placement in the hearth, small pieces catching flame first, followed by larger ones that will burn long into the evening. Oddly, some pioneers even kept a small log in the corner to test the draft of the cabin at night. If it smoked too much, adjustments were made immediately. You grin at how precise, almost ritualistic, the process becomes when survival is at stake. By the end of the day, you feel the weight of what a woodpile represents. Hours of work, hundreds of logs, careful arrangement, and constant maintenance all condensed into a system that sustains life. Without it, warmth is fleeting, meals go cold, and sleep becomes a battle against frost. The pioneers knew this intimately. They lived by it, breathed it, and passed the knowledge down like a sacred art. And as you sit near your imagined hearth, you can almost hear the logs crackling, the cabin exhaling warmth, and the outside world frozen but respected, waiting for the next day's labor. You sit by the hearth for a moment, letting the warmth seep into your frozen fingers, and then realize, the room is still mostly dark. Outside, the sun has dipped behind the horizon hours ago, leaving shadows stretching and merging in strange, almost mischievous ways. You probably won't last long in this darkness without some kind of light, and that's where pioneers' ingenuity really shines. Candles, oil lamps, and an almost ritualistic attention to light become lifelines in the long winter nights. You reach for a candle on the rough wooden table. Oddly, some pioneers made their own from tallow, animal fat, rather than the beeswax you might picture. You can imagine the smell, slightly acrid, a far cry from the sweet aroma of modern candles, but it works. Lighting it is an art. Strike a flint, coax the spark, and watch the tiny flame come alive, flickering in a dance that is both mesmerizing and essential for survival. Scholars still argue whether homemade tallow candles produced enough light for detailed tasks or simply provided psychological comfort, but either way, they are indispensable. Oil lamps are even more fascinating. You wander closer to one, noting the small glass reservoir filled with rendered animal fat or vegetable oil. The wick absorbs it slowly, burning steadily, and creating a golden halo that pushes back the darkness. Oddly, some families even added scraps of cloth or herbs to their wicks, which could subtly change the color of the flame or the scent in the room. You inhale the faint aroma and smile at the strange combination of practicality and sensory indulgence. You notice how lighting one source of illumination changes everything. Shadows retreat, revealing rough wooden walls, stacked firewood, and tiny decorative touches, a dried flower here, a hand-carved spoon there. It's as if light itself restores not just vision, but calm, warmth, and the confidence that the night can be endured. You start to understand why pioneers placed such care into their light sources. A poorly placed candle isn't just inconvenient, it's a safety hazard. Sparks could ignite straw, blankets, or even the pile of logs nearby, and survival quickly turns from careful to catastrophic. You wander over to a lamp hanging from a hook near the hearth. Oddly, some communities experimented with reflecting mirrors behind lamps to maximize illumination, a surprisingly sophisticated trick for a pre-electric era. You squint as the golden glow spreads across the room, realizing that pioneers were constantly experimenting, measuring, and adjusting, not just for comfort, but for efficiency. Every flame is intentional, and every shadow teaches a lesson in attention. You sit back in a creaking chair, watching the flicker, and notice how light becomes a storyteller. Shadows dance across the walls like ghosts of past inhabitants, and you can almost hear their whispered routines: stirring the pot, patching chinking, mending clothing. Even children would learn the rhythms of light, associating certain tasks with certain times, long before any clocks existed. Scholars still argue whether this reliance on flame-created schedules affected long-term circadian patterns, but for now, you simply enjoy the warmth and clarity it provides. Oddly, the pioneer sense of light also included a kind of playful artistry. They would sometimes trim wicks to control brightness, place multiple candles at varying heights, or even fashion makeshift lanterns from tin cans with pierced holes that cast star-shaped patterns on the walls. You can't help but admire this aesthetic touch. It's practical survival, yes, but also a celebration of human creativity in the face of relentless cold and darkness. As the night deepens, you realize that illumination isn't just about seeing, it's about presence. Every flickering glow is a signal that someone is alive, awake, and vigilant. Even a single lamp can anchor a family through long hours, providing focus for tasks, entertainment, or quiet reflection. Oddly, some pioneers would carry a single lamp from room to room, ensuring that no corner of the cabin remained too dark for safety, but also creating a moving rhythm of light that gently organizes their world. By the time you settle near the hearth again, candles casting soft glows on rough wood, you start to appreciate the intimacy of pioneer nights. Unlike modern life, where light is omnipresent and taken for granted, these small, deliberate flames require attention, care, and respect. They teach patience, mindfulness, and an appreciation for small victories, like successfully lighting a wick without blowing it out, or arranging multiple lamps so shadows don't creep into corners. You close your eyes briefly, letting the gentle flicker fill your vision. Oddly, the quiet hum of an oil lamp is soothing, almost meditative, and you start to understand why pioneers would gather around their lamps not just for chores, but for storytelling, music, and shared reflection. The glow becomes more than light, it becomes comfort, rhythm, and life itself in the frozen darkness outside. Scholars still debate whether these lighting practices were more about practical necessity or psychological well-being, but from where you sit, the distinction seems almost irrelevant. Both are vital, and as you listen to the faint crackle of the fire and watch the lamp's tiny dance, you realize something crucial. Survival in the pioneer winter wasn't just about firewood, shelter, or food. It was about light, attention, and the ability to carve warmth, vision, and calm out of a world that offers none for free. You let that thought settle, a gentle ember glowing alongside the literal flames, and for a moment, you feel an intimate connection with a time long past but profoundly alive in this quiet, candlelit moment. You rise from the flickering warmth of the hearth and glance down at yourself. Right now, you're probably imagining your pajamas or a cozy hoodie, but out here in a pioneer winter, what you wear could mean life or frozen misery. Layering isn't optional, it's survival. You probably won't make it 5 minutes without understanding that wool, linen, and animal hides are your silent allies. You start with the basics: a shift or undershirt, often homemade from coarse linen. Oddly, the rough texture can be abrasive at first, but it traps small pockets of air, a simple but brilliant trick for insulation. Scholars still argue whether linen or wool next to the skin was more effective, or whether pioneers simply used what was available, but either way, the principle is clear: multiple layers trap warmth. Next comes the woolen layers. You tug on a thick, knitted waistcoat or a handwoven skirt over your undergarments. You feel the heaviness and scratchiness, but it's deliberate. Each layer captures heat, holds it close to your body, and creates a microclimate that can withstand a sudden gust of icy wind. Oddly, some families even inserted old animal pelts between layers for extra warmth, a solution that might seem eccentric today but worked remarkably well. You move on to outer garments. A heavy wool coat, lined with fur if available, wraps your torso. You cinch it close, feeling the wind's bite slightly softened. Boots are stuffed with dried moss or straw to insulate your feet, a quirky little hack that doubles as cushioning. Gloves are layered too, a thin linen liner under a thicker wool mitten. Oddly, you might even find some pioneers wearing 2 pairs of socks, not just for warmth, but because one could be swapped out if dampness threatened frostbite. Scholars still debate whether such layering was learned instinctively or carefully taught across generations, but from where you stand, it's both art and necessity. You step outside, snow crunching beneath your insulated boots, and feel how each layer interacts with the wind. Some layers flap, others hug your skin, some soak up moisture, while others repel it. Pioneers understood that clothing wasn't just fabric, it was engineering. Oddly, decorative elements like braided cuffs or patterned stitching weren't purely aesthetic. Sometimes they doubled as reinforcements at stress points or even as emergency identification in case someone got lost in the snow. Your hands brush the rough wool of a scarf wrapped around your neck, and you realize how these small details are critical. Neck, head, and extremities are priority zones. A pioneer hat might be tipped with rabbit fur, mittens sewn with double layers, boots tucked into thick wool leggings. Even tiny gaps are addressed. Oddly, children's clothing often had extra layers added at night, almost like a wearable sleeping bag, to account for their smaller bodies losing heat faster. Inside, the layering strategy continues. You notice how pioneers would remove layers selectively. A thin undershirt for indoor chores, heavier garments for the outdoors, and perhaps a wool cloak for tending animals. This adaptability shows a subtle intelligence. Warmth isn't static, and survival requires reading both body and environment. Scholars still argue whether layering techniques were regionally standardized or adapted entirely by circumstance, but clearly, it was flexible and intuitive. You pause for a moment, imagining the sensation of damp socks against your skin. You shiver and tug them off, replacing them with dry ones tucked into your boots. Oddly, some families kept a small cache of dried moss or cloth inside boots for extra insulation, a clever and low-tech solution to the problem of frozen toes. You realize the pioneers' layering wasn't just about warmth, it was about preparedness, foresight, and creativity. Even hair and head coverings played a role. Wool caps, scarves, or hoods trap heat that otherwise escapes rapidly from the body. Oddly, some hats had small flaps sewn in to protect ears during windstorms, an almost whimsical, yet highly functional, design choice. You adjust a hood over your imagined head and feel instantly more secure. Survival here isn't glamorous, it's attentive, iterative, and surprisingly inventive. You catch yourself admiring the tactile details. The roughness of wool, the weight of layered fabrics, the way materials shift and cling, trapping heat in pockets. Every stitch, fold, and knot has purpose. Oddly, some pioneers even scented garments with pine needles or dried herbs, part superstition, part mosquito deterrent, and part small comfort in the relentless cold. Scholars still debate whether these scents served more as psychological support than practical use, but you can see the logic. Comfort and warmth go hand in hand. By the time you've layered up fully, you feel cocooned, almost armored against the wind's bite. Every motion feels deliberate, calculated for survival, but also oddly empowering. The pioneers' lessons in clothing teach you that warmth isn't just about insulation, it's about strategy, preparation, and respect for the elements. You might look odd, clumsy even, but each layer is a tiny victory against the winter outside. And as you wander back to the hearth, snow crunching under heavily insulated boots, you feel the satisfaction of understanding. Surviving a pioneer winter isn't about heroics or brute strength, it's about the thoughtful accumulation of small advantages, each layer building on the last, each decision informed by necessity and experience. The chill outside no longer feels absolute. Instead, it becomes a backdrop, a challenge met quietly, ingeniously, one layer at a time. You step toward the hearth again, the warmth hugging your layered body, and suddenly your stomach grumbles, a reminder that survival isn't just about warmth, it's about food. You probably won't last long without understanding how pioneers cooked without electricity, relying instead on ingenuity, patience, and a few surprisingly clever hacks. The hearth dominates the room, a central command post for all culinary endeavors. You notice the blackened iron pots, their surfaces scarred from countless fires. Oddly, some pots have small dents or uneven bottoms, not defects, but a testament to adaptability, improvised repairs, and even storytelling. Scholars still argue whether pioneers preferred cast iron over copper or brass for heat distribution, but every household seems to have had its own standard, often dictated by availability rather than preference. You reach for a cast iron pot and imagine the process: kindling a fire, letting it burn down to glowing coals, then carefully placing the pot above the heat. Cooking here is slow, deliberate. Water takes longer to boil, stews require constant attention, and even baking bread becomes a patient, multi-step ritual. Oddly, some families would use a thick layer of ashes to moderate heat, essentially creating a primitive oven inside the hearth itself. It's messy, ingenious, and entirely functional. You notice the tools scattered around: wooden spoons, metal hooks, trivet stands, and sometimes a curious little pot within a pot setup that allows simmering without scorching. Oddly, pioneers even used stones heated in the fire to warm water or cook food indirectly, a clever trick that seems almost magical until you imagine handling a red-hot rock with mittened hands. Scholars still debate whether this technique was widespread or limited to resourceful households, but either way, it shows an inventive mindset that electricity never forced them to develop. You move a step closer to the fire and inhale the aroma: roasted root vegetables, stewing meats, and the faint smoke of burned pine wood. Food is survival, yes, but also comfort. Oddly, some families would cook smaller portions of food repeatedly rather than a single large batch, conserving both fuel and attention. You imagine the rhythmic chopping, stirring, and tasting, a kind of culinary dance synchronized with the hearth's unpredictable heat. You pick up a skillet, its surface rough with age, and imagine frying something simple, perhaps salted pork or a handful of dried berries. You realize cooking without electricity demands acute awareness. Timing, heat, and placement of each pot are critical. Move too close, and the contents scorch; too far, and they cool before ready. Oddly, children would often be enlisted to rotate pots or stir stews at precise intervals, a quirky chore that also educated them in the nuances of thermal management. Baking is a whole other challenge. You picture a small, enclosed brick or stone oven built adjacent to the hearth. Dough is placed inside, occasionally rotated, and heat is carefully managed with coals shoveled in or removed. Oddly, pioneers sometimes used a thin layer of cornmeal on the oven floor to prevent sticking and to add subtle flavor. Scholars still argue whether this method was a traditional inheritance from Europe or an American innovation, but either way, it's a small testament to resourcefulness. Even simple tasks like boiling water require strategy. Water must be heated in a pot suspended above coals or placed in a shallow pan atop glowing embers. Oddly, some households would place a small stone in the water to prevent it from boiling over, a quirky, low-tech innovation that shows how pioneers learned by observation and trial. You realize that cooking here is as much about managing tools and heat as it is about ingredients. You notice how meals are often communal. Food isn't just sustenance, it's a rhythm that punctuates the long winter days. Families gather around the hearth, sharing stories while stirring pots or breaking bread. Oddly, some households even had a test pot, with just water and a pinch of flour or herbs to gauge the heat before committing the main meal, an inventive little safety measure. Scholars still debate whether such rituals were functional or psychological, but you understand, they are both. By evening, the aroma fills the cabin, blending with the smoke, warmth, and quiet hum of survival. You sit near the fire, watching steam rise from the pot, imagining the careful choreography: kindling, chopping, stirring, rotating, tasting, adjusting. Oddly, you notice small quirks: soot-streaked mittens drying nearby, a spoon resting in the ashes to keep it warm, and herbs hanging overhead not just for seasoning, but for subtle health benefits. Scholars still argue whether these small touches were strictly practical or influenced by superstition, but you sense the pioneers' lives are a blend of both. As you dip your hand toward the warmth radiating from the stove, you realize cooking without electricity is more than survival. It's mindfulness, rhythm, and an intimate understanding of materials, temperature, and timing. Oddly, the act of preparing food becomes almost meditative, every motion intentional, every ingredient respected. You might imagine tasting the stew now, the flavors simple but rich with necessity, each bite a celebration of ingenuity, patience, and warmth earned. By the end of the evening, the cabin is alive with aroma, light, and quiet satisfaction. The fire burns low, the pots are emptied or simmering, and you feel the slow, steady heartbeat of survival. Oddly, you notice how the act of cooking without electricity connects the pioneers not just to their needs, but to each other and to the rhythms of nature itself. In this moment, warmth isn't just heat, it's nourishment, routine, and life itself. You step away from the hearth for a moment and think about the bigger picture. Surviving the winter isn't just about warmth and meals, it's about making sure there's food to eat when snow piles higher than your knees. You probably won't last long if you ignore the art and science of winter food preservation. Your eyes wander to the corner of the cabin where barrels, bins, and wooden boxes stand. Oddly, some are lined with straw or sawdust, a subtle insulation that keeps root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and potatoes from freezing solid. Scholars still argue whether this method was universally effective or depended heavily on the type of soil and local climate, but you can see the logic. Cold slows spoilage, but controlled cold prolongs life. You reach for a turnip, feeling its firm skin beneath your fingers. Oddly, pioneers sometimes wrapped individual roots in dried leaves to prevent bruising or rot. This small, meticulous attention to detail feels almost obsessive, but in the face of a long winter, every extra day of freshness counts. You realize that preservation isn't a single act, it's a strategy layered across weeks and months, requiring foresight, labor, and a little creativity. Meat preservation is another complex system. You imagine a slab of salted pork hanging from a ceiling beam, or perhaps a side of venison smoked over a slow fire. Oddly, some families would rub the meat with a mixture of salt and ash, a quirky, practical hack that keeps flies away and slows decomposition. Scholars still debate how much of these techniques were derived from European traditions versus innovations born in the harsh American frontier, but the effectiveness is undeniable. Root cellars fascinate you next. You kneel in the imagined dirt floor, cool and slightly damp, feeling the stone walls that stabilize temperature throughout the season. Oddly, some pioneers even planted small herbs or flowers nearby, believing that their scent preserved food or at least deterred pests. You can almost feel the chill in the air, the faint earthy aroma, and the subtle hum of life stored safely below ground. Dried fruits and grains are a different challenge entirely. You picture berries strung on thread, hanging from beams, and jars of beans or corn stacked meticulously. Oddly, some pioneers would store jars upside down, a quirky trick thought to keep out insects or mold. Scholars still argue whether this method truly impacted longevity or was simply tradition passed down from parent to child, but it's clearly a ritual with purpose, reinforcing a mindset of careful, attentive stewardship. You walk past a barrel of sauerkraut, the tangy smell hitting your nose. Fermentation is alive in this world. Cabbage, pickles, even small fruits preserved in brine. Oddly, some families would mark the progress with tiny notches on the container, tracking which batch was oldest or most potent. You realize preservation here is an active process, not passive. It's constant observation, subtle adjustments, and a deep understanding of natural processes. Even ice preservation comes into play. You imagine a block of ice cut from a frozen pond and stored in straw-lined pits, carefully rotated to last through the months. Oddly, some families even layered thin cloths between ice blocks to slow melting. Scholars still debate whether these ice caches were essential for survival or merely convenient, but you know from imagining it that every little advantage counts when temperatures drop and food options dwindle. You pause and consider the ingenuity in every detail: wrapping, salting, smoking, drying, burying. Oddly, some households would even sprinkle a tiny amount of sugar on fruits to extend shelf life, a practice that feels almost modern. You realize that winter food preservation is as much about creativity and observation as it is about brute strength or labor. Every preserved item is a small victory, a safety net, a buffer against hunger and hardship. By evening, the preserved foods are organized, protected, and ready for consumption. You can almost feel the satisfaction of knowing that the hard work of summer harvest and autumn preparation pays off during the darkest, coldest months. Oddly, you notice a small ritual, tasting a piece of preserved fruit or root, just to make sure it's still edible. Scholars still argue whether this was necessary or psychological, but you understand, it builds confidence and keeps routines alive. You step back from the storage, feeling a strange sense of security. Food preservation in pioneer winters isn't just about avoiding hunger, it's about cultivating foresight, respect for natural cycles, and a gentle rhythm of labor and reward. Oddly, even the quirks, the ash-rubbed meat, the upside-down jars, the straw-lined barrels, become part of a philosophy of survival that blends practicality, tradition, and human ingenuity. And as you wander back to the hearth, the aroma of simmering stew mingling with your imagination of stored foods, you realize something profound. The pioneers' winters were mastered not by brute force, but by careful observation, inventive hacks, and the patience to tend, rotate, and respect every morsel. Oddly, you feel a connection across time. Each preserved carrot, each smoked slab of meat, is a whisper from the past reminding you that survival is as much about preparation as it is about courage. You sink back into the warmth of the hearth, your layered clothing and the flickering lamps creating a cocoon against the winter's chill. Outside, the wind whistles like a ghost, but inside, time moves differently. You probably won't survive long here without some form of mental engagement. Boredom can feel almost as lethal as frostbite. Luckily, pioneers had a surprisingly rich arsenal of indoor activities and entertainment. You glance around the cabin and notice simple objects, wooden toys, a spinning wheel, scraps of fabric, and a few well-worn books or almanacs. Oddly, the roughness of these materials doesn't diminish their charm. Instead, it adds texture, literally and figuratively, to daily life. Scholars still argue whether these objects were primarily utilitarian or meant for pleasure, but in practice, they serve both purposes. You pick up a set of carved wooden dolls, imagining children crouched on the floor, inventing elaborate stories to pass the time. Oddly, some pioneers would use scraps of old clothing to make doll outfits, each stitch a small lesson in sewing and creativity. You realize that indoor play wasn't just entertainment, it was practical training. Children learned dexterity, patience, and imagination while avoiding the biting cold outside. Your gaze shifts to the spinning wheel. You imagine hands turning it slowly, drawing wool into threads, a rhythmic, meditative motion that transforms raw materials into something useful. Oddly, the spinning wheel could also be a social tool. Families might gather, each member contributing, sharing stories, and humming tunes. Scholars still argue whether spinning circles were primarily functional or served as early forms of social bonding, but the atmosphere seems undeniably comforting. Board games and card games appear next in your mind's eye. Oddly, some pioneers would invent games on the spot, using coins, pebbles, or scraps of paper. These impromptu creations reveal an ingenious adaptability. You're struck by how necessity fuels creativity, even in leisure. Scholars still debate whether these games had standardized rules or were entirely local inventions, but the essence is the same: entertainment, engagement, and connection. You imagine the quiet sound of knitting needles clicking against each other, a slow, almost hypnotic rhythm that fills the cabin. Oddly, patterns often incorporate both functionality and art. Mittens, scarves, and socks might feature intricate designs while keeping the family warm. You realize that art and utility coexist seamlessly in pioneer life. Every stitch, every loop, is a small victory, a distraction from winter's monotony, and a tangible contribution to survival. Music plays a subtle role too. Perhaps someone plucks a fiddle, or a wooden flute rests under a child's hand. Oddly, even simple songs or chants help track time and pace work. Learning lyrics or melodies is a blend of education, entertainment, and emotional comfort. Scholars still argue whether music served more practical purposes or psychological ones, but the effect is clear: lightness of heart in a harsh world. Storytelling dominates the long nights. You can almost hear the crackle of fire punctuating tales of local legends, family exploits, or far-off lands. Oddly, exaggeration is a valued skill. The taller the tale, the more engaged the listeners. Scholars still debate how much oral tradition influenced historical record keeping, but there's no doubt that stories shape resilience. You notice how the room breathes with these narratives, connecting generations, offering laughter, lessons, and occasional cautionary tales. Sometimes, indoor work becomes entertainment too. Oddly, mundane tasks like mending clothes, churning butter, or shelling beans are performed in a sort of ritualistic rhythm, often accompanied by conversation, songs, or small competitions. You realize that the pioneers transformed labor into shared experience, reducing monotony and enhancing survival skills simultaneously. You glance at a small window, snowflakes swirling outside like drifting stars, and feel how the cabin is both world and stage. Every activity, from spinning wool to playing a game, is carefully choreographed to occupy minds, maintain morale, and ensure a sense of accomplishment. Oddly, even simple acts like sweeping the floor or arranging firewood indoors carry satisfaction. They produce visible results and a sense of control over an otherwise harsh environment. As evening deepens, the cabin glows with the quiet buzz of activity. You watch the interplay of lamplight, shadows, and movement, the way spinning wheels cast hypnotic patterns, children's hands manipulate toys, and elders hum softly. Oddly, you notice how these moments of engagement also cultivate resilience. Creativity, patience, and emotional endurance are as essential as warmth and food. Scholars still debate how much structured versus improvised entertainment impacted mental health, but it's clear that pioneer ingenuity in this area was extraordinary. You sit back, letting the warmth and sounds envelope you. Oddly, even the quietest moments, watching shadows flicker across rough wooden walls, carry their own subtle satisfaction. Indoor activities aren't just distractions. They are survival strategies, emotional anchors, and intimate connections that make the long winter nights not just bearable, but alive. And in that gentle glow, you realize how profoundly human ingenuity can transform constraint into comfort. You shift in your chair near the hearth and notice little hands tugging at your sleeves. Children, you probably won't survive long as a pioneer if you underestimate the challenge of keeping them safe, warm, and entertained when the world outside is a frozen expanse. Winter childcare isn't just about supervision, it's a constant balance of warmth, nutrition, attention, and teaching survival skills. You glance around the cabin and see tiny beds layered with straw, blankets, and wool. Oddly, some families even tucked small pouches of dried herbs between layers, lavender or mint to keep pests away and subtly soothe restless children. Scholars still argue whether these aromatic interventions were truly effective or largely psychological, but the effect on the child's comfort is clear. You imagine a child bundled in multiple layers, wool socks tucked into boots, a cap covering ears, mittens over small hands. Oddly, families sometimes pin small scraps of fabric to clothing to prevent wear in high-friction areas, a quirky mix of practicality and parental care. You notice how every movement, every layer, is carefully considered. Warmth isn't optional, it's survival. Feeding is a delicate choreography. You picture children sitting at the hearth, wooden spoons clutched in mittened hands, bowls of porridge steaming. Oddly, some parents would carve tiny portions of dried fruit or add a pinch of sugar, just enough to entice the young eater without wasting precious supplies. Scholars still debate whether such strategies were widespread or limited to families with more resources, but the principle is universal. Small incentives encourage cooperation and growth. Play is surprisingly essential. You imagine children weaving miniature sleds from scraps of wood or using carved animals in imaginative stories by candlelight. Oddly, some games were designed to teach skills, counting, dexterity, or even basic survival tactics like knot tying. Scholars still argue how much structured versus improvised play influenced lifelong skills, but clearly, winter boredom was dangerous, and ingenuity turned it into education. Nap times are a strategic operation. You notice how children are placed close to the hearth or wrapped in layered bedding to retain heat. Oddly, some families would even place small heated stones near the blankets, carefully monitored to prevent burns, a quirky, low-tech solution to the persistent cold. Scholars still debate whether such practices were more common in frontier regions or universally adopted, but the ingenuity is undeniable. You imagine storytelling sessions around the fire. Oddly, parents often tailored stories to teach lessons. caution against wandering too far, respect for animals, or the importance of helping with chores. Scholars still argue whether oral storytelling was more about moral instruction or simply entertainment, but you can see how it does both. The flickering light animates the tales, and children learn to associate warmth, safety, and knowledge all in one place. Hygiene and health are subtle challenges. You picture small buckets of warm water and washcloths, children carefully cleaned before bed. Oddly, some households added small amounts of pine needles or herbs to the water, partly for scent, partly for antibacterial properties. Scholars still debate the actual effectiveness, but the routines instill habits and offer comfort against winter illnesses. Education blends seamlessly with survival. Oddly, children often learn while performing chores. Stirring porridge teaches attention, chopping kindling teaches hand-eye coordination, and folding laundry teaches order. Scholars still argue whether this informal pedagogy had long-term educational outcomes, but from where you sit, the children are learning skills that textbooks never could teach. By evening, the cabin is a symphony of gentle sounds. A child humming softly, another turning a small wooden toy, the hearth crackling nearby. Oddly, you notice subtle strategies. Rotating children between warmth zones, keeping one always near an active lamp, and creating a rhythm that balances play, rest, and education. You realize that childcare in the harsh winter isn't a passive task, it's an active, strategic orchestration. As you sit back, watching tiny faces reflected in candlelight, you feel the deep layers of care and ingenuity required. Oddly, every quirk, every careful adjustment, every improvised toy or heated stone is part of a philosophy of survival. Children are nurtured, protected, and educated simultaneously. Scholars still debate how much of this was necessity versus ingenuity, but the outcome is clear. Life thrives even in the harshest conditions when attention, creativity, and love intersect. You lean closer to the hearth, imagining little heads finally resting, warm, secure, and comforted. Oddly, even the smallest moments, adjusting a blanket, whispering a story, checking a mittened hand, carry profound significance. Winter childcare is survival, education, and affection all folded into one continuous, delicate practice. And as the fire glows and shadows dance across the walls, you realize that the pioneers' nights were filled with quiet triumphs, small victories of care and foresight that echo in every heartbeat of the family. You step away from the hearth and notice the cabin's corners, the subtle scents and the small arrangements that speak to something essential: sanitation. You probably won't survive long if you ignore hygiene and health in these long, harsh winter months. Pioneers knew that warmth, food, and clothing alone weren't enough. Disease and infection were invisible threats, lurking as silently as frost. You notice a simple chamber pot tucked under a table or in a corner. Oddly, some families would line the pot with straw or moss, not just for comfort, but to make waste disposal easier and to minimize odor. Scholars still argue whether these methods truly reduced disease transmission, but pioneers recognized that attention to sanitation, however rudimentary, was essential for survival. You imagine washing routines. Buckets of water are heated over the hearth, and washcloths or small tubs are carefully used for bathing. Oddly, some families would add pine needles, herbs, or even animal fat to the water, not merely for scent, but with the belief it improved health or prevented illness. Scholars still debate whether these practices had tangible antiseptic effects or were largely psychological, but they clearly provide warmth, comfort, and a ritualized sense of cleanliness. Waste disposal is a daily choreography. You picture the family carefully timing trips outside to a privy or latrine, layering snow or ash to minimize smells and reduce freezing hazards. Oddly, some pioneers kept small tools or scoops specifically for redistributing waste, showing an almost obsessive attention to detail. Scholars still argue whether such meticulousness was widespread or limited to more organized households, but it highlights a deep understanding of risk management. Laundry is another intricate process. You imagine heavy fabrics dunked, scrubbed, and boiled over the hearth. Oddly, some families would sprinkle wood ash on fabrics to remove stains and odors, a primitive, slightly abrasive but effective detergent. Scholars still debate how effective this really was for hygiene versus aesthetics, but the routine instilled discipline and helped prevent skin infections and infestations. You notice small health measures around the cabin: herbs hung near windows, vinegar in bottles for cleaning, and floors swept meticulously. Oddly, some families even set aside separate utensils or drinking vessels for sick members, a surprisingly advanced form of quarantine. Scholars still argue whether these measures significantly reduced illness or were largely symbolic, but they demonstrate the pioneers' keen awareness of contagion risk. You imagine treating minor injuries. A scraped knee or small burn is carefully cleaned, sometimes with boiled water, herbs, or animal fat. Oddly, odd folk remedies coexist with practical first aid. Poultices made from plant roots or honey, sometimes mixed with flour. Scholars still debate the efficacy, but these practices illustrate a blend of observation, experimentation, and necessity. Every household seems to cultivate its own medicinal knowledge, passed down like a treasured recipe. Food hygiene is closely tied to survival. You picture careful handling of preserved meats, dried fruits, and dairy. Oddly, some pioneers would rotate storage containers or cover them with cloths treated with vinegar or herbs, reducing spoilage and contamination. Scholars still argue whether these methods were effective against all pathogens, but the repeated attention shows a clear priority: prevent illness before it starts. Even the cold itself is managed with health in mind. You notice how drafts are blocked, windows sealed, and bedding layered to prevent exposure. Oddly, some families would sprinkle flour or ash around the hearth floor to reduce slipperiness, a quirky safety measure that also limits accidental injuries. Scholars still debate whether these measures were standard across regions, but they reflect an instinctive understanding of risk mitigation in harsh environments. By night, you sit back near the hearth and consider the broader picture. Sanitation and health in pioneer winters are a mix of observation, intuition, and learned practice. Oddly, even small rituals, washing hands before meals, checking bedding, or cleaning a pot carefully, become acts of survival and reassurance. Scholars still argue how much formal knowledge versus experiential learning contributed to these practices, but the lessons are clear. Attention to detail, consistency, and mindfulness of the body's needs can be as critical as firewood or clothing. You lean closer to the glow of the lamp, noting the clean arrangement of the cabin and the careful placement of tools, pots, and bedding. Oddly, there's a subtle satisfaction in order. Each careful act of sanitation carries weight, each routine a protective shield against the unseen hazards outside. You realize that managing health in winter isn't glamorous or heroic, it's quiet, repetitive, and deliberate. And in this quiet attentiveness, you understand a profound truth. Survival is built on small, consistent acts of care, each one echoing across time to keep families safe, warm, and alive. You step outside for a moment, feeling the crisp bite of winter air against your layered clothing. You probably won't survive long without understanding the lifeblood of the pioneer cabin: firewood. Heat isn't just comfort, it's survival, cooking fuel, and even a psychological shield against the relentless cold. You glance across the snowy yard, imagining a pile of logs stacked neatly near the cabin. Oddly, some pioneers would alternate logs by size and orientation, creating small air channels for better ventilation and easier drying. Scholars still argue whether this stacking technique was widely standardized or a quirky regional habit, but it clearly improves burn efficiency. Gathering firewood is a skill, requiring knowledge of tree types, wood density, and how long each piece takes to season. You probably won't make it far without recognizing that pine burns fast and hot but leaves behind a sticky residue, while oak or maple smolders longer and holds heat. Oddly, some pioneers would mark their logs with small notches to track dryness, tiny inscriptions serving as practical records. Chopping is a deliberate, rhythmic activity. You imagine the swing of an axe, the satisfying split of a log, and the shiver of cold that runs down your back. Oddly, some families even trained children with small, blunt hatchets, carefully supervised. Scholars still debate whether these practices were safe or primarily out of necessity, but the rhythm, repetition, and skill building are undeniable. Transporting wood is another layer of challenge. You picture sleds loaded with logs, scraping over packed snow, pulled by horses, oxen, or even children in small batches. Oddly, some pioneers would coat sled runners with animal fat or grease to reduce friction, an improvised, almost whimsical hack. Scholars still argue whether these methods were practical in all climates, but it clearly made winter labor more manageable. Storage is as critical as gathering. You notice carefully constructed woodsheds, often raised slightly off the ground to prevent moisture absorption. Oddly, some pioneers would cover the top of the pile with bark or a layer of straw, letting sides remain exposed for airflow. Scholars still debate the effectiveness, but the strategy demonstrates a nuanced understanding of how wood interacts with weather and temperature. You imagine the indoor arrangement. Logs stacked near the hearth, sorted by size and dryness. Oddly, some families would place a small, test log in the fireplace each morning to gauge burn quality, a quirky yet practical ritual. Scholars still argue whether this was widespread or limited to highly organized households, but you recognize the value. Predictability in fire management can save both fuel and frustration. Firewood management also teaches foresight. You visualize families spending mild days outdoors, replenishing supplies before storms hit. Oddly, some pioneers even kept small branches and kindling inside the cabin in clay or metal containers, ensuring a backup in emergencies. Scholars still debate whether indoor storage of kindling was a common practice or risky due to fire hazards, but it underscores the principle: preparation trumps improvisation. Even the choice of what to burn first reveals strategy. You imagine seasoned hardwood reserved for overnight fires, softer wood for quick daytime warmth, and scraps for kindling. Oddly, some families used old, cracked barrels or furniture remnants in extreme scarcity, a quirky testament to survival improvisation. Scholars still argue whether such practices were frequent or last resort measures, but they highlight the adaptability essential for winter survival. By nightfall, you stand near the stacked wood inside the shed, fingers brushing against rough bark, smelling sap, and feeling the promise of warmth radiating from the carefully arranged piles. Oddly, even the sound of logs settling or small creaks in a stack carries a subtle reassurance. Each piece is a tiny insurance policy against the cold. Scholars still debate how pioneers balanced firewood consumption versus gathering labor, but the principle is clear: thoughtful planning ensures the hearth burns continuously, life continues uninterrupted, and the winter feels less like an enemy and more like a challenge met steadily, one log at a time. You step back toward the cabin, imagining the fire crackling and dancing on the hearth. Oddly, the act of managing firewood becomes almost meditative. You appreciate the smell of pine, the texture of rough oak, and the careful choreography of gathering, chopping, transporting, and stacking. It's hard labor, yes, but it's also strategy, rhythm, and reassurance. And in this quiet, deliberate attention to fuel, you understand an essential pioneer truth. Warmth is cultivated, not taken for granted, and every log is a small victory over winter's relentless grip. You sit by the fire, the warmth pressing gently against your layers, and notice a pile of clothing in the corner. You probably won't survive long if you don't recognize that in winter, every stitch counts. Clothing isn't just protection, it's a lifeline, and pioneers treated mending and crafting as both necessity and craft. You pick up a wool sock with a thin, worn patch. Oddly, some families would reinforce socks with scraps of old garments, creating a patchwork that looks quirky but is surprisingly resilient. Scholars still argue whether this, reinforced patching, was a standardized technique or simply trial and error ingenuity, but the principle is clear: durability can save toes from frostbite. You imagine threading a needle, pulling thick linen or wool through tiny holes, the rhythm slow and deliberate. Oddly, pioneers sometimes used sinew from animals instead of thread, a tough, natural material that stretches slightly and lasts far longer than most commercially spun threads. Scholars still debate how common this practice was versus using spun fibers, but it demonstrates a blend of resourcefulness and necessity. Even small garments receive attention. You picture mittens, caps, and scarves being repaired before each day begins, seams reinforced, holes patched, and edges bound with extra thread. Oddly, decorative stitching is often functional too, strengthening stress points while adding a personal touch. Scholars still argue whether this was aesthetic preference or subconscious ingenuity, but you can see the dual purpose clearly: beauty and survival coexist. Spinning and weaving are ongoing indoor crafts. You imagine pulling fibers from raw wool, twisting them into threads, and weaving them into cloth. Oddly, some pioneers incorporated unusual materials, like blending rabbit fur or flax, to achieve both warmth and durability. Scholars still debate whether such experiments were regional innovations or household specific, but the creativity is unmistakable. You notice the careful sorting of materials. Oddly, families would keep worn out garments, scraps of fabric, and even torn blankets for future repairs or crafting. Scholars still argue whether this was thriftiness or necessity, but clearly, nothing was wasted. Every thread, patch, and fiber could be repurposed to extend the life of essential winter clothing. Button replacement and fastening maintenance are a subtle art. You imagine tiny wooden or bone buttons sewn onto coats, often reinforced with extra stitches. Oddly, some households even carved replacement buttons from small pieces of scrap wood, using rudimentary tools yet achieving surprisingly functional results. Scholars still debate whether this DIY approach was widespread, but it emphasizes the pioneers' ability to improvise with available resources. Children are often enlisted in clothing care. You picture little hands carefully darning socks or threading needles under supervision. Oddly, some families turned this into playful competitions: who could mend faster or more neatly, blending skill building with entertainment. Scholars still argue whether these activities significantly contributed to dexterity and patience, but you notice the dual benefit: clothing lasts longer, and children learn valuable survival skills. Even outerwear receives constant attention. You imagine coats being brushed to remove snow, seams inspected for fraying, and small holes patched before exposure to wind or wet. Oddly, some families added small interior layers or hidden patches for reinforcement, invisible to the eye but vital for warmth. Scholars still debate whether this was common knowledge or highly skilled households, but the principle remains: foresight preserves life. Crafting goes beyond repairs. You picture gloves, scarves, and hats being made from scratch, spun and sewn with care. Oddly, some items included quirky embellishments, braided cords or embroidered edges, that doubled as identification or simply family pride. Scholars still argue whether ornamentation distracted from utility or enhanced it, but you see that creativity and practicality walk hand in hand. By the time you finish imagining a small pile of mended and crafted clothing, you sense a rhythm: observe, repair, reinforce, and create. Oddly, even the repetitive act of sewing becomes almost meditative, connecting past to present through skill, patience, and intention. Scholars still debate the efficiency of such handcrafted methods compared to mass-produced alternatives, but in the pioneer winter, there was no alternative: every stitch mattered. You lean back, admiring the repaired mittens, patched socks, and carefully woven scarves. Oddly, you realize that survival isn't just about having clothes, it's about actively tending to them, prolonging their usefulness, and embedding a quiet ingenuity into every fiber. Clothing repair and crafting are acts of foresight, creativity, and persistence, subtle triumphs that ensure warmth and life through the long winter months. You sit quietly by the hearth, the snow outside falling in thick, muffled layers. You probably won't survive long if you ignore the mental challenge of isolation. Winter stretches endlessly in the frontier, and the quiet can be as biting as the cold. Coping isn't just about distraction, it's about rhythm, connection, and finding small joys in a seemingly empty world. You notice the small routines that break the monotony. Oddly, some pioneers would create daily, task rituals, assigning each family member a rotation of chores, from tending the fire to feeding animals to repairing clothing. Scholars still argue whether these routines were primarily for efficiency or psychological stability, but you sense their subtle power: structure transforms emptiness into purpose. Reading and storytelling are lifelines. You imagine a child curled near the fire, eyes bright, as an elder recites letters from faraway relatives, folk tales, or improvised stories. Oddly, some stories are exaggerated for humor or suspense, a way to sneak excitement into otherwise dull winter days. Scholars still debate how much oral tradition shaped cultural continuity versus simple entertainment, but the effect is undeniable: isolation is softened by narrative. You glance at small personal projects: carved wood, knitting, or journaling in ledgers. Oddly, some pioneers kept detailed diaries of weather, food stores, and daily routines, partly to track survival and partly to stave off boredom. Scholars still argue whether this record keeping was practical, emotional, or both, but the act of documenting life instills a sense of agency and purpose. Music also combats solitude. You imagine someone strumming a worn fiddle or plucking a homemade flute. Oddly, tunes might be simple, repetitive, or improvised, but the sound fills the cabin, connecting minds across time and space. Scholars still debate whether music served more as emotional therapy or social cohesion, but in practice, it is comforting, familiar, and alive. Even conversation is carefully curated. You notice how families practice a gentle balance, engaging discussions when energy is high, quiet reflection when the fire dims. Oddly, some households develop story chains, each person adding a line to a tale, creating collaborative narratives that grow over days or weeks. Scholars still debate whether such improvisation enhances cognitive skills, but it certainly builds connection and shared identity. Animals provide both companionship and routine. You imagine a dog circling near your feet, a cat curling by the hearth, or livestock gently shifting in their stalls. Oddly, some pioneers spoke to their animals like confidants, sharing updates or humoring the silence. Scholars still argue whether this was primarily emotional comfort or ritualized habit, but you feel its soothing effect, presence, warmth, and connection, however unconventional. You realize that small, deliberate actions combat mental fatigue. Oddly, some pioneers would invent minigames or competitions. Who could chop firewood fastest? Who could weave the tightest braid? Who could guess the weather first? Scholars still debate how structured these activities were, but they clearly inject novelty and engagement into the long, repetitive winter days. Observation becomes a meditation. You watch snowflakes drift past windows, feel subtle shifts in light across the cabin walls, and notice the faint sounds of distant wildlife. Oddly, pioneers might sketch or carve impressions of these moments, turning observation into both art and reflection. Scholars still argue whether these records were primarily aesthetic, emotional, or functional, but the effect is consistent. Attention to small details grounds the mind. By night, the cabin hums with quiet resilience. You notice the rhythms of isolation, work, play, rest, observation, each a lifeline. Oddly, even mundane conversations, shared stories, or the quiet hum of spinning wheels against the backdrop of the fire become profound. Scholars still debate the psychological impact of long-term isolation on pioneer families, but you can feel the answer. Adaptation, mindfulness, and connection preserve both sanity and spirit. You lean closer to the warmth of the hearth, imagining a deep, steady breath and the small victories of surviving day after day in the quiet cold. Oddly, isolation is softened not by grand gestures but by simple, deliberate routines, creative expression, companionship, and mindfulness. In this cocoon of quiet, you realize how profoundly human beings can endure, even thrive, when they actively cultivate rhythm, attention, and connection. You shift in your chair and glance around the cabin, your eyes tracing the organized chaos of supplies and tools. You probably won't survive long if you don't plan for the unexpected. Pioneer winters were full of surprises, blizzards, sudden food shortages, illness, and accidents. Emergency preparedness isn't paranoia, it's an art, a constant dance between foresight and resourcefulness. You imagine small caches of supplies hidden in corners or beneath floorboards. Oddly, some families buried extra food in straw-lined boxes, just in case a storm blocked paths or snow drifted high enough to isolate the homestead. Scholars still argue whether these secret stashes were standard practice or rare innovations, but the principle is undeniable: redundancy saves lives. You notice carefully maintained tools: axes, knives, saws, and shovels. Oddly, some pioneers marked them with notches or symbols to indicate ownership, maintenance status, or even seasonal use. Scholars still debate whether these markings were practical, ritualistic, or a bit of both, but you realize they reduce confusion and keep preparedness consistent. You picture a family discussing emergency routines. Oddly, some would rehearse storm drills, deciding who fetches firewood, who checks on livestock, and who tends to food stores. Scholars still argue how formalized these rehearsals were, but you see the benefit. Mental rehearsal strengthens response under pressure, making fear manageable and action instinctive. Medical contingencies are equally important. You imagine boxes of herbs, tinctures, and bandages arranged within reach. Oddly, some families kept small reference notes for treating injuries or common illnesses, written in child-friendly shorthand. Scholars still debate the accuracy versus practicality of these instructions, but the intention is clear. Knowledge ready at a moment's notice can prevent minor problems from becoming fatal. You consider extreme weather survival. Oddly, some pioneers built small snow shelters or emergency windbreaks near the cabin, even in mild winters, as practice or backup. Scholars still argue whether these were widely used or experimental, but you sense the ingenuity. Preparation meets creativity, and imagination becomes a survival tool. Fire management is part of contingency planning. You imagine extra kindling, smaller logs, and even dried moss stored specifically for emergency fires. Oddly, some families kept a few charred starter logs that ignite instantly, an almost ritualistic, quirky trick passed down generations. Scholars still debate whether such methods were crucial or clever habit, but in a life or death freeze, every second counts. Food rationing strategies are subtle but vital. You picture families monitoring consumption, reserving high-calorie foods for periods when physical labor or emergencies demand it. Oddly, some pioneers would create mystery rations, small portions set aside, never touched unless a real shortage strikes. Scholars still debate whether this was psychologically reassuring or purely practical, but the principle is solid. Controlled scarcity prevents panic. You notice overlapping systems. Food caches, medical supplies, emergency firewood, and layered clothing reserves. Oddly, some families even kept small items hidden, like a favorite toy or trinket, to lift spirits during extended storms. Scholars still argue whether emotional preparation was formally acknowledged, but you recognize its importance. Morale can be as critical as warmth. By evening, the cabin feels both cozy and fortified. You lean closer to the hearth and imagine scenarios. A blizzard cutting off the path, a sudden illness, a misstep in the snow. Oddly, every precaution, every stash, and every rehearsed routine transforms potential chaos into manageable challenge. Scholars still debate whether pioneers always anticipated disasters or learned through trial and error, but the principle is clear. Foresight, organization, and creativity turn winter from a deadly threat into a manageable environment. You take a deep breath, feeling the weight and reassurance of preparation. Oddly, even the quirks, the buried boxes, starter logs, snow drills, and hidden trinkets, carry subtle comfort. Contingency planning isn't glamorous, it's deliberate, thoughtful, and quietly heroic. And as the fire crackles and shadows dance, you realize that survival is crafted not only through labor and skill, but also through vigilance, imagination, and unwavering foresight. You sit back near the hearth, the flickering fire painting warm shadows across the walls. You probably won't survive long if you forget the human element of all this survival: resilience. Pioneer families endured winters that would break most spirits, not just because of the cold, but because of the relentless demands on body, mind, and emotion. Reflection becomes a quiet reward, a moment to appreciate endurance and ingenuity. You notice small tokens of legacy around the cabin: hand-stitched quilts, carved wooden toys, journals filled with weather notes, and tiny repairs in worn clothing. Oddly, these objects are both practical and symbolic. They tell stories of survival, creativity, and familial love. Scholars still argue whether pioneers consciously considered legacy or if it emerged organically, but the evidence is clear. Human presence leaves traces, and these traces preserve lessons for future generations. You imagine the family gathered at the hearth after chores, children rubbing tired eyes, adults sipping thin broth, and everyone sharing the small victories of the day. Oddly, even the most mundane achievements, a perfectly stacked woodpile, a mended sock, a well-tended animal, carry immense emotional weight. Scholars still debate whether such acknowledgement was formal or simply felt, but the effect is unmistakable. Each act strengthens resilience. Stories are the heartbeat of legacy. You picture parents recounting tales of hardship, triumph, and humor from winters past. Oddly, exaggeration is common. A frozen pond that nearly swallowed a sled, a stubborn cow that refused to be milked, a mischievous child hiding firewood. Scholars still argue whether oral tradition preserved historical accuracy or simply conveyed values, but you feel the deeper purpose: continuity, identity, and emotional grounding. Education and skill sharing are woven into survival. You imagine children learning knot tying, cooking, spinning wool, or building snow windbreaks while adults guide them patiently. Oddly, some lessons are disguised as games or playful competitions, making endurance and skill acquisition enjoyable. Scholars still debate whether this informal pedagogy was intentional or instinctive, but clearly, knowledge transmission is essential to legacy. Community and neighborly care subtly reinforce resilience. You imagine a visiting family trading eggs for flour, sharing news, or swapping stories. Oddly, some pioneers maintained secret signals for emergencies or shared tips for extreme conditions, almost like a clandestine support network. Scholars still argue how formalized these arrangements were, but cooperation clearly enhances survival odds. You reflect on ingenuity and creativity as enduring traits. Oddly, many pioneer solutions were quirky: heated stones under bedding, homemade buttons, improvised toys, but the combination of observation, experimentation, and practicality ensured survival. Scholars still debate whether these innovations were learned individually or culturally transmitted, but their persistence is undeniable. Human creativity thrives even under duress. Resilience isn't just about surviving the immediate challenge, it's about cultivating a sense of mastery, control, and hope. You notice how small rituals, checking firewood, mending clothing, tending the hearth, sharing stories, build confidence and emotional endurance. Oddly, even minor successes feel monumental after days of hardship. Scholars still argue how mental fortitude develops under extreme conditions, but you sense its profound impact. The family becomes a unit of both survival and legacy. You imagine looking back from a distant future, seeing evidence of endurance everywhere: quilts stitched with care, journals filled with observations, patterns of resourcefulness in every household chore. Oddly, even the quirks, the funny mishaps, inventive hacks, playful inventions, become part of the story passed down. Scholars still debate whether survival skills or cultural creativity leave a longer lasting legacy, but you realize that both are intertwined. As you lean closer to the hearth's warmth, you feel a deep sense of continuity. Oddly, survival, ingenuity, and care are inseparable from storytelling, daily rituals, and the attention paid to both people and environment. Reflection reveals that pioneer winters weren't just a test of physical endurance, they were a stage for resilience, creativity, and love. Scholars still argue whether modern descendants fully appreciate these lessons, but sitting here, imagining the lives behind every flickering shadow, you understand, legacy is quietly built through patience, resourcefulness, and heart. You exhale slowly, the firelight dancing on your face, and for a moment, you let the weight of history and human effort settle in. Oddly, the lessons of survival and resilience feel intimate and immediate, as if every log stacked, every story told, and every patch sewn whispers directly to you. And in this soft glow, you see clearly that legacy isn't written in grand monuments, it's stitched into daily acts, preserved through care, creativity, and unbroken attention to the lives we nurture around us. You lean back in your chair, letting the warmth of the hearth seep into your shoulders. The snow outside has quieted, muffling all sounds into soft, even silence. You probably won't notice how tense your body was until you exhale slowly, feeling it melt away with the flickering shadows on the walls. Every small detail you've imagined tonight: stacked logs, patched clothing, children's laughter, careful routines, folds gently into this quiet moment, like a soft blanket draped over your thoughts. You notice the subtle rhythm of the cabin, the faint crackle of the fire, the occasional pop of sap in a log, the soft hush of snow settling outside. Oddly, even in imagined hardship, there's a sense of calm, a slow pulse that threads through every careful action and tiny triumph. Scholars still argue whether this quiet perseverance shaped emotional resilience, but you can feel it tangibly here, like a gentle, reassuring hum. Your mind drifts to small, ordinary moments: the smell of herbs, the softness of worn quilts, the careful choreography of daily life. Oddly, these tiny acts of attention and care become monumental in their cumulative effect, building warmth, safety, and a subtle joy that survives even the harshest winters. You let yourself savor that realization, feeling a quiet gratitude for human ingenuity and perseverance. As you exhale again, you notice the edges of your awareness softening. Shadows blur, your breathing slows, and the imagined cabin feels warm, secure, and peaceful. Oddly, the lessons of survival, the patience, foresight, creativity, and care, transform into a gentle lullaby for your mind. You feel connected to something larger. The quiet, deliberate rhythm of life that carries through generations, soft and enduring. Now, dim the lights completely, let your shoulders loosen, and allow the hum of memory, imagination, and quiet resilience to settle around you like snow drifting over a winter field. Everything feels tender, soft, and still. And as you exhale one final time tonight, whispering comfort to yourself, know that the quiet triumphs of yesterday ripple softly into your own world, leaving you held, warm, and ready to drift into rest.